Great. Thank you, Tamarind. I see why they grouped us together. I really appreciate the community-oriented nature of your effort, and you guys are not afraid of complexity, which I also appreciate. Okay, so individuation, methodologies for cultivating and assessing agential efficacy. I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation, and also thanks to all the organizers for their really hard work on this. Okay, this talk is going to be split into 3 parts. I'm going to start with, let me get my notes set up here. I'm going to start with problematizing measures of success in practice in the field, and then move on to section 2, which will look at individuation as a theoretical model for addressing agential efficacy. And then section 3 will return to a practice in the field with this theoretical model as a possible way to cultivate agential efficacy. Okay, so this is a project that when I worked for a science museum, the Exploratorium here in San Francisco, I was helped co-found a group that tried to take the informal hands-on science pedagogy of inside the museum, outside the museum. This particular project that I'm going to talk about really quickly, Buchanan Mall, we were invited by a traditionally disenfranchised community through really kind of horrible redevelopment practices over the last 50, 60 years. That this community was invited by us to help them go through an activate this space, this shared park that's at the center of their community, and then do a visioning document in partnership with other municipal and nonprofit groups in order to envision what an updated park would look like. Civic agency is one way to substantively edify relations able to cultivate agential efficacy, but what is agency and how is it cultivated? We did the standard, the popular approach of co-design, where the vision for the park upgrade was co-developed with the members of the community. They were incorporated into our traditional, both our fabrication and our design process. But during this process, and again, this timeline, we were brought in here primarily at the beginning to help this activation and the visioning. But even at this early stage, I could already sort of sense how things like structural disenfranchisement sustain themselves by really well-intentioned people. Even our engaged ethnographic efforts, having discovered core community desires, were subtly and systematically molded towards status quo outcomes. So what is the point of quant qual outcomes, no matter how accurate they may seem, if what we do is predetermined by pre-existing structural habits? So for example, this is a much more recent image of the final design for the subsequent park. And what I want to note is that essentially this park is very similar to the previous image that I showed. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, so this is the existing park: concrete, grass, trees, lacks people. You add people, but it's still mainly concrete, grass, and plants and trees. There is a park in this one, but there's parks in that just weren't in the picture on a different block. And so the question is that, after we led this activation process that consumed a lot of time and effort, both on our part, but certainly on the community's part, to support this visioning process, actually another design firm, the design firm that came up with this design, went through basically the same process we went through with the same or similar community members. And then the question is, for what? And this is over the course, again, this is from 2015 when we got involved to basically now. So I was a bit frustrated. I still work with some of the nonprofits in the area, which I'll get to in a moment. and hearing their stories, I was a bit frustrated. So I began to do my own research, going back to 1969. Arnstein has this somewhat in the literature for urban design and community engagement, has some pretty well known paper she did on what she called the ladder of citizen participation. And even back in '69, when HUD, back in the day, the federal government was trying to sort of right redevelopment wrongs, that they wanted to, in order to do that, they wanted to engage communities and try and give them a platform, give them power to increase their agency in these processes that affect them very substantially. And so she noted that, as you can see here, there's no power, degrees of tokenism, and then actual degrees of power. And what I realized when I applied that to our own process, again, this is written in 1969, and here we are in 2021. What I realized is that we were probably at the consultant level, given what the difference between what it is we discovered, the core desires of the community, versus what it is actually ended up in the final design, and that maybe at best it could be considered placation with this. So this kiosk here, this blue kiosk over here, is actually one of the things that the community wanted, because back in the day they lost this central kind of market, Virgo's market. And so they really wanted that nexus, if you will, that point of community connection, of exchange. They wanted somehow that built back in, because they lost it over not just that one story, but many Black-owned businesses in this area. And so sort of the sad thing is, the punchline, if you will, for this first section is that even though this blue kiosk is in the design, it wasn't actually in the budget. So in other words, they went and got $5 million to do all these plants and the concrete and the benches, et cetera. But this kiosk is explicitly not in the budget. And I'll come back to our attempt to remedy that. But first, I want to really take a hard turn to models in order to, again, try and understand how it is these systems of disenfranchisement and oppression really tend to sustain themselves by really well-intentioned people. So to do this, to try and escape this habit of disenfranchisement or lack of agency, I went back to a theory I developed previously, whose principal observation is that events in nature, including agency, are both distinct and interrelated simultaneously all the way down. And so what I'm illustrating here with the drops of water, the drops have already happened, they've already impacted the pond, but this interference pattern is very importantly, it embodies both the initial impact, but also their interrelation, the interference pattern, this among them in this common medium, it embodies the relationships between what were once distinct and separate events. Okay, so what I wanted to say about individuation really quickly, and again, there's just so much to say about this model, but this is, given the format, I'm just going to really gloss over and jump to some of the conclusions, and we could talk about those if we have time. So individuation isn't just differentiation. Let me go back to this. Let me just stay on this slide for a moment to focus on these points. Individuation isn't just differentiation. Paradoxically, in the spirit of Heraclitus, agential efficacy is proportional to the agent's capacity to resolve the contradictions in their world within themselves and between the two. Individuation is predicated on the capacity to both mold and be molded by the medium the individual is enmeshed within. And that disenfranchisement in this model, and also I argue in reality, is to have no affordances to mold one's world, only to be molded. So to stick with the abstract for a moment, to stick in the theory, we could imagine that each of these black nodes is I want to follow my notes because I could go on and on about this. I want to stay within time here. So, okay. So imagine a model of agents with diverse sympathies. So this model is that you can imagine these black dots here. And the diverse sympathies are represented by, say, their tuning forks, for example, or oscillators that are sympathetic to these resonant frequencies, these diverse resonant frequencies that are above them. As they are stimulated by the environment to different patterns, they respond uniquely and emote into their shelled milieu accordingly. This creates an interference pattern in this shared medium as they respond to their milieu, enacting tension, as illustrated by the interference pattern, which is the source of novel higher order dimensions. And this is really important, this idea of that what's generated, that's what's embodied in this interference pattern, in this tension, a word that's been used a bit by a number of other folks so far in this conference, is these higher order dimensions. Now the sparse order, so the sparse order being sort of this figure, if you will, which may relate to Michael Richardson and Rachel Callan's talk, as it is in essence symmetry breaking, as this pattern rises above the noise floor, what I'd call the ground. So this is sort of in a Gestalt sense, is a figure ground situation, emergent dynamic figure ground situation, that this order, this emergent real-time embodied order, can be harnessed to then over here bias the network towards more complex sympathies. So how this would actually work, I don't have time to get into now. I'd love to talk about it if people are interested later. But the basic idea is that these structural biases emerge so that instead of it's just individual nodes responding as individuals, they're responding as a collective. So this is just a heuristic model, but I think it contributes to the conversation on agential efficacy, both at the individual organism and social scales, because no matter the scale of the dynamic system, each node's access to power, both literal and figurative, is predicated on the structural biases they can be part of. Confederated nodes will tend to outcompete isolated nodes. Okay, so very formal definition of, I didn't put the math here on this one, but formal definition of complexity. So there's a lot more to say about this model, as I said before, but to echo Hannah Dieger's talk, a precondition of agential efficacy is the capacity to oscillate between over and under what she calls determination and what I would call coherence, so over and under coherence. So on this side, you have the under coherence, like randomness, and on this side, you have, great, thanks. And on this side, you have overcoherence. So, and what needs to happen is a balance within the parabola here, that you could build both distinct patterns and then patterns of patterns, that requires oscillating back and forth between over and under coherence. Now, as this applies to the social scale, we can invoke Marilyn Strathern's famous quote that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. That would be an example of overcoherence or overdetermination. This builds off Goodhart's law and Campbell's law and other perverse incentives. And it's also reflective of a centralized top-down governance that tends to, as in this example here, tends to silence the other nodes because one pattern dominates. Agential efficacy and individuation is predicated on the freedom to find an optimal rhythm between these extreme states. Deny this freedom and you deny agential efficacy. Okay, so just a couple slides back to practice. So in practice, how do we increase agency? To escape structural habits of alienation and disenfranchisement, we need to resolve tension between existing institutional habits and disenfranchised agents by prototyping novel institutions which serve as a common medium able to cultivate these novel dimensions, the source of novel work pathways. This, I think, echoes Bert Hodges' idea of values being an ecological phenomenon and necessarily an ongoing task. For example, this opportunity hub, it's a grant that we then subsequently got to fill in the gap for the $5 million budget that didn't include the kiosk, that essentially is this open space. I mean, it's a constraint on what can happen, but it's simultaneously it's an affordance for an openness of different ways to showcase different community members' wares and food and activities. Now, this isn't a revolution, but an opportunity for ceaseless evolution. Take a lesson from nature and actively complexify species of institutions faster than surrounding cultural selection pressures can assimilate novelty. In other words, create novel higher order dimensional work pathways faster than they can be co-opted to existing dominant pathways, a kind of guerrilla symbolic exchange, if you will, for you Baudrillard fans. And just to conclude, I will read a quick quote about Elinor Ostrom, who is very influential. And then so Kincaid is commenting on Ostrom's project, and he says that diversity is not the same as complexity, and complexity is not the same as chaos, yet these concepts are linked. Ostrom, in her autobiographical essay, A Long Polycentric Journey, refers to persistent and recurring critiques from colleagues that her explanations and models introduce too much complexity. In the studies of local governments that ended up as the theory of polycentric governments, she and her colleagues had to battle against the perception that many local government units producing diverse regional services, these multiple dimensions that I'm talking about, create chaos. So that's their argument against these kinds of generative institutions. And then Kincaid argues it created complexity, not chaos, which I would agree with. So whether quantitative or qualitative, we need generative institutions that embrace their own tensions and constantly create new measures faster than state institutions or market forces can co-opt them into habitual targets. This type of complexity is not only the source and the result of relevant individuation, but also a resistance to the overcoherence of the state. This complexity thwarts the state's good intentions, which inexorably endeavors to normalize relations, thereby unknowingly mitigating resilience. Thank you.